Here's the difference. The enlisted man didn't exactly have great luxurious conditions at Fort Phil Kearny. Anybody want to guess how much they made a month to be a soldier?
$15.
Yep. Close. $13 a month is what a soldier's pay was. $13 a month, which would be about $197 in today. Now, all you kids that work during the summer, I would assume, make more than $197 a month working in the summer. You probably wouldn't do it. So that gives you a little bit of an idea how poor the pay was. But a lot of these soldiers, I can't remember if I mentioned this class or the other class, a lot of these soldiers that joined because they had no life after the Civil War. So there are a lot of Southerners, and also a lot of foreign people that came over from foreign countries that didn't have anything to do or no life ahead of them. So a lot of the military was foreigners as well. So the pay was not good. Soldiers usually lived in a barracks. We mentioned they didn't build very luxurious barracks. They were kind of basically a shelter with a dirt floor, and they had one stove in there to keep 60 men warm in the winter. So about 60 men in these barracks had a dirt floor and one stove. Some soldiers got kind of innovative, and what they did is they actually kind of dug primitive basements in the dirt floor, and they took the stove and put it down in the basement or the hole and cooked their food so that the heat would rise and keep them warm at night. Because it was tough sledding in the middle of the winter. I mean, you've been to Sheridan, Story, Wyoming, and I'm sure that it can get very cold, and so those soldiers dug, quote, basements in the barracks, and they would cook and use the heat that came up from the basement for warmth. I know this seems a little weird in today's society, but don't take it the wrong way. Back then, it was so cold and they had such a hard time keeping warm, it wasn't unusual for the fellows to kind of cuddle up, so to speak, to each other in the evenings to try to keep warm because it was so cold in some of those winter, and especially the first winter they were there. They didn't eat very well either. As we mentioned, I think Kendrick mentioned, why didn't they go outside the fort, or maybe it was Fudge, and shoot this game? Well, the obvious reason is because they didn't want to take a chance of losing their life. So the conditions that they ate were not very good in comparison to the officers. One thing they ate was hardtack. Does anybody know what hardtack is? Elizabeth?
Isn't it like a brick of like a hard brick of just disgusting, I don't know, like a cracker brick?
It is, very good. It's like a big saltine cracker that's hard as a rock. I mean, there wasn't much nourishment, and that, I'll have to get, I thought Mr. Winkler had some of those, maybe showed you in 8th grade back in the day, I had heard. But you can still kind of order those samples. I'm gonna have to get one of those in trade. But they were just basically, probably 2-inch by 2-inch, very hard crackers. Like Dash had mentioned, they weren't very nutritious at all. I compared to maybe eating athletic tape that's frozen. I mean, that would be probably pretty similar, you know what I mean? They did have coffee. There wasn't much problem having coffee. The taste of the coffee probably depended on the person that made it that particular day. They did have the opportunity to have a little brown sugar to put in their coffee for a little bit of sweetening. And they also ate quite a bit of lard or animal fat. Okay, none of these are too appealing, but that's what they ate. And they ate a lot of salt pork. Does anybody know what salt pork is?
Just pork that's been dipped in loads of salt, and you just put it in your mouth and it absorbs all the moisture.
Just kind of to preserve it. They take this pork and they soak it in salt, and it kind of preserves it, so to speak. And some of this salt pork that they were eating at Fort Phil Kearny was left over from the Civil War. So a lot of it was 1, 2, 3 years old. So they did not eat very well. Because of this poor diet, a lot of the soldiers got a condition called scurvy, which is basically a lack of vitamin C. And it results in a lot of issues: tiredness, muscle weakness, joint and muscle aches, rashes on the legs, bleeding from the gums. You always hear about people who always want to get your vitamin C, because if you don't, it'll tear your body down. And these soldiers did not get a lot of vitamin C at Fort Phil Kearny, thus many of them suffered from scurvy, which is a deficiency in vitamin C. Now, as we mentioned, Although wild game was available outside the fort, Colonel Carrington barred any hunting by soldiers in fear of having them killed. What about civilians? Could Carrington give orders to civilians to stay in? Probably could have, but didn't. His feeling was that you're a civilian, you're not under Army rules. If you want to go out and hunt, go ahead. Very few civilians did, though, for the same reason, because they were not interested in putting themselves at risk of being killed outside the fort. Now, these enlisted men did get a treat once in a while. Didn't last that long, but for a while it was a luxury. They had a Negro cook, female Negro cook at Fort Phil Kearny named Black Susan. Not politically correct today, but that was the name at that time. And what she did is she would bake pies, and then she would sell them to the soldiers, the enlisted soldiers, for $1 each, which was about $15 in today's money. So I mean, you make $13 a month, and they were very eager to spend $1 every once in a while to buy one of her pies. Well, Colonel Carrington was a little bit of a killjoy, and he could see that Black Susan was making a little cash on the side, and he found out she was obviously using Army flour and Army canned fruit to make these pies, and so he put a kibosh on the pies, and poor enlisted men didn't get any more pies. So that was the only real luxury that enlisted people had. Your civilians, and especially your officers at Fort Phil Kearny, lived a much more acceptable lifestyle. Officers actually had really nice homes built for them. Colonel Carrington's home was very spacious in consideration of the day. As I mentioned, he had a nice fireplace in that home. He had a really nice kitchen. He and his wife Margaret lived in that house. They had 2 sons, and they even had a butler by the name of George. Did I say something weird?
Yeah.
So Colonel Carrington was probably the best example of that. He had a very nice home for those standards, had a fireplace, real big kitchen. He and his wife Margaret lived there with their 2 sons, along with a butler by the name of George. Now, as we kind of mentioned yesterday, the safest place for any soldiers or civilians was inside the fort. Life outside the fort was risky. People became very vulnerable, had a greater chance of being killed by the Indians. The fort was a very safe haven. These Native Americans in the area, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, were not interested in attacking or going on the offensive against a defended fortification. So their goal, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, would always be to try to get the people out of the fort to get rid of them. So the fort was safe. If you were inside the fort, you were in pretty good shape. Now that'll take us to the story of Ridgway Glover, a man who decided to try his chances outside the fort. And we'll tell you what happened. The story of Ridgway Glover, of course.
Is he the first one in Carly?
No, but he's the one that the story is most interesting because of his situation. Ridgway Glover was actually a man from the East. He was born in New Jersey in 1831. He was a man of Quaker faith. Anybody know what Quaker faith is? Very conservative religion, very, very conservative. So he was born into Quaker faith. He was born in New Jersey in 1831. And as he was growing up, he developed a tremendous interest in this new and exciting technology of photography. Brand new back in those days. And he kind of got into it, so to speak. He thought this photography was intriguing, and he took a tremendous interest in this new and exciting technology of photography. So he decided that's what he would study. He would study photography and be a man that took photographs, photographer. Well, he got pretty good at it, and he got the idea that he wanted to go west, because not many people had been west, and he wanted to photograph this western frontier and kind of photograph history of people moving west, photograph forts like Fort Phil Kearny. That was his goal. He wanted to do that, but he didn't have any money. Didn't have a lot of money. You don't make a lot of money in the photography business, especially in the 1860s, right? So what he did, it was kind of interesting, he went to this new Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and he asked them if they would be interested in any photos that he might take if he went west. And in return for those photos, they would do what? Finance his trip. So to finance his trip west, Glover reached out to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., and he requested what they called a sponsorship from the Smithsonian to travel the western frontier and take photographs, and in return for that sponsorship or paying for him going out there, he would make all of his photographs available to the Smithsonian Institution for display. And they agreed, they thought it was awesome. So they sponsored him, and he traveled to the western frontier. And he actually went to 3 different areas to photograph. The first place he went was Fort Laramie. Took some photographs at Fort Laramie. Then he followed the Bozeman Trail all the way up to Virginia City and took some photos of that mining area in Virginia City. And he finally then arrived at Fort Phil Kearny.
So he wasn't an original citizen.
What's that?
Like he didn't come with
No, he came later. Yeah, he came later, yeah. He came in, like the mid-1860s is when he ended up coming out. And he went to Fort Laramie first, and then he went along the Bozeman Trail all the way up to Virginia City, and he somehow ended up back at Fort Phil Kearny. Well, he, despite witnessing Indian ambushes on a regular basis, constantly found his way outside the fort to take these photographs, and he would return safely, which was a little unusual. So again, Glover constantly found his way outside the fort to take photographs, even after witnessing Indian ambushes on a regular basis. Where were most of the Indian ambushes happening outside the fort?
Probably at the watchtower.
No, not so much there.
Bozeman Trail.
No, when the woodcutters were out cutting wood. Yeah, that's who got most of the harassment. They were really the only ones outside the fort, had to be, and then they were guarded by soldiers. So there was a kind of a constant battle there. Well, after pushing his luck a little too far, on September 16th of 1866, his dead body was discovered a short distance from the fort. So he had been out successfully several times. And finally, on September 16th of 1866, his disregard for his own safety catches up with him, and they find his dead body just a short distance from the fort. Now, he had really long flowing hair at the time. When they found him, guess what? It was all gone, and not from a nice barber razor, as you might imagine. They scalped him, totally removed his long flowing hair. He lay face down, and his back was split in half by a tomahawk. So historians predict that he probably did not experience a very good death and was probably even tortured prior to dying. So Ridgway Glover got out there one too many times, got caught by the hostiles, was scalped, his once flowing long hair totally removed, laying face down with his back split in half by a tomahawk. Now, the reason maybe that they didn't really mutilate him, I think they probably tortured him and he had a horrible death. And the reason why they treated him so poorly, according to historians, is they didn't understand this photography. And they considered it bad medicine. It was a bad thing religiously. And so he was looked upon as kind of the devil, so to speak, by being able to take these images and photography. The Indians were afraid of photography. And so that's probably why he was treated so brutally when he was killed. What's kind of sad about that, they never found any of the photos he took anywhere. Okay, none at Fort Laramie, none at Virginia City, none at Fort Phil Kearny. Nobody located those, and that's really unfortunate. I think that would have been an incredible piece of history if somebody would have been able to accumulate those and get them back, but no one did. He wasn't able to create that pictorial history of the American West like the Smithsonian was hoping he would, didn't find any of them. Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic then, which is the Battle of Pino Creek. The Battle of Pino Creek. This kind of sets the stage for the Indian philosophy here, the Battle of Pino Creek. This happened on December 6th of 1866. And this battle, which was a kind of a small skirmish, was fought near Fort Phil Kearny on nearby Pino Creek. Well, what happened is kind of was a usual thing. Indians attacked these woodcutters, and the men were forced to flee back to the fort. And when that occurred, more soldiers were sent from Fort Phil Kearny to relieve the woodcutters as they were retreating back to the fort. In other words, they didn't have enough soldiers really to protect this particular attack like they normally did. So the soldiers that were out there on that duty held them off as long as they could as they fled, the woodcutters, and then they sent additional troops out of the fort to support the troops that were out there. Well, this is really important you understand. These soldiers that went out went over a ridge called Lodge Trail Ridge. And were incredibly lucky to get back alive. They went over this ridge called Lodge Trail Ridge. And these soldiers were incredibly lucky to get back. Basically what you have, you can picture this in your mind, is if you go over, and you'll see this if we go on the trip and you want to go, if you go over Lodge Trail Ridge, you kind of go into a bowl, and it's surrounded by bluffs. So if you would get in the middle of that bowl, you would be incredibly vulnerable from all sides. And so these soldiers were very, very lucky to get back. And Carrington had warned his soldiers about going over that ridge from basically day one. And they didn't really listen to him. And 15 days from now, 15 days from December 6th, they're going to have another issue concerning Lodge Trail Ridge that's going to result in a disaster. Okay? The point about this Battle of Pino Creek is once the Indians saw that they could sucker or bait men over Lodge Trail Ridge, their philosophy became, oh, this is how we're going to do it. We're going to set them up and we're going to try to get a larger force over the top of Lodge Trail Ridge and see if we can ambush them. That was kind of their philosophy. Which takes us to that ambush, which is called the Fetterman Fight, or you could call it a massacre, depending on what side you were on. Remember we talked about that? If the Indians get crushed in a battle, what do we call it in history? A fight. If the Indians beat white troops in battle, it's a what? Massacre, right? So you can decide what you think it is here. So as I mentioned, the December 6th skirmish with soldiers at Pino Creek kind of created a new strategy for the Indians against the soldiers. The Indians realized if they could lure the soldiers out of the fort, as they had done on December 6th, they might have a better opportunity to kill them. So, on December 21st of 1866, those lookouts on top of Pilot's Knob signaled down that another wood train was under assault by Indian warriors. So the men that had the responsibility of observing on top of Pilot's Knob saw that a wood train was again under attack and signaled down that they would need some relief. Well, one of the officers, Captain William Fetterman, approached Colonel Carrington and said, I would like to lead my men against these Indian warriors who were assaulting the wood train. He asked for the duty. He goes to Colonel Carrington and says, I'll take my men and we'll relieve the wood train. He volunteers. He was a little overzealous guy, a little bit. And when Carrington heard Captain Fetterman's request, he granted him permission. So Fetterman led 81 men out of the gates of Fort Phil Kearny. here is what he let out, just so you know, this is the details. He let out 49 infantrymen. Those are soldiers
On foot?
on foot, okay? He let out 49 infantrymen. "27 cavalrymen, which are men
On horse?
on horses. He had 2 officers with him, Lieutenant George W. Grumman and Captain Frederick Brown. He had 2 officers with him, Lieutenant George W. Grumman and Captain Frederick Brown. And he had 2 civilians with him, James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher. Okay? So he's got 49 infantrymen. He's got 27 cavalrymen. Besides himself, he's got 2 officers, right? And 2 civilians. So, including Fetterman, how many we got? 49, 27, 76. Grumman 77, Brown 78, Wheatley 79, Fisher 80, and Fetterman 81. So he didn't lead 81, I guess he led 80. Okay, but there were 81 total.
The civilians just wanted to go.
What's that, Wheatley and who?
The civilians who
Yeah,
like
well,
volunteered.
kind, yeah, they were kind of civilians that were, that's a good question, they were attached to Fetterman's command. They could have said no, but they wouldn't, okay?
This was December what again?
22nd.